The final gavel fell at 4:47 p.m. on a gray Seattle afternoon, and with it, Adrian Royce walked away with everything. I sat in the polished mahogany courtroom watching my ex-husband's perfectly practiced smile as Judge Morrison ruled in his favor, granting him sole ownership of the waterfront home I'd funded with 3 years of 16-hour days building my fintech company from nothing. The prenuptial agreement I'd signed during what I now recognized as a deliberately orchestrated romantic haze had contained language so carefully crafted that even my attorney seemed genuinely surprised by its implications. "Mrs. Tran, Judge." Morrison's voice cut through my mental calculations. "Do you understand the court's ruling?" I rose smoothly, adjusting the charcoal blazer I'd chosen specifically for this moment. Professional, expensive, unreadable. "Yes, Your Honor, completely. Understood." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Adrian's legal team exchanged glances that didn't quite mask their relief. They'd expected theatrical tears, desperate appeals, perhaps the kind of emotional breakdown that would have validated their client's carefully constructed narrative about his unstable workaholic ex-wife. Instead, they got the same composed demeanor I'd perfected through countless board meetings and venture capital presentations. "The court sympathizes with your position," Judge Morrison continued, his tone suggesting genuine regret, "but the prenuptial agreement is legally binding. The property transfers as specified." I nodded once, gathering my leather portfolio with deliberate precision. Behind me, I could hear the shuffling of reporters. 3 major Seattle outlets had covered our divorce proceedings. Drawn by the story Adrian's publicist had so expertly seeded, successful architect versus tech entrepreneur, creative soul against corporate machine, charming everyman fighting for what was rightfully his. What they didn't know, what none of them had bothered to investigate, was that the rightfully his narrative collapsed under even basic scrutiny. The down payment for our Belltown waterfront home had come from my company's first major acquisition. The renovation costs nearly $400,000 had been funded by my second-round venture capital raise. Even the custom architectural elements Adrian had designed were paid for through my personal accounts, not his firm's. But the prenup, signed during a candlelit weekend in Napa when Adrian had convinced me that marriage without financial protection was the ultimate romantic gesture, had designated any property purchase during our marriage as belonging to whichever spouse's name appeared on the primary deed. A detail I'd overlooked in my haste to prove I trusted him completely. The courthouse steps were slick with October rain as I emerged, immediately surrounded by microphones and cameras. Adrian appeared moments later, his arm around his publicity manager, a blonde woman whose job seemed to involve looking adoringly at him during photo opportunities. "Mr. Royce," called Rebecca Chen from Seattle Metropolitan, "how does it feel to finally have this chapter behind you?" Adrian's expression shifted into what I'd once found endearing, a boyish vulnerability that suggested he was uncomfortable with attention despite clearly courting it. "It's been incredibly difficult, Rebecca. When someone you love becomes so consumed by their career that they lose sight of what really matters." He paused, letting his voice catch slightly. "Well, I just hope Celia can find some peace now." The performance was flawless. I had to admire his commitment to the role of wounded husband forced to fight for basic dignity against his ruthlessly ambitious ex-wife. Several reporters turned toward me expectantly, clearly hoping for the confrontation that would round out their evening news segments. "Miss Tran," called James Morrison from the Seattle Times, "any response to Mr. Royce's comments?" I considered my options. The part of me that had built a company through sheer determination wanted to detail exactly how Adrian had manipulated our relationship, how he'd positioned himself as the creative genius while systematically benefiting from my financial success. The part of me that had learned to navigate Seattle's insular tech scene understood that emotional responses, however justified, would only validate Adrian's narrative. Instead, I smiled the same calm, professional expression I'd used when Microsoft tried to lowball my first acquisition offer. "I wish Adrian all the best," I said simply. "I'm looking forward to focusing on my work and moving ahead." The reporters looked disappointed by my restraint, but I was already walking toward the parking garage where my driver waited. Behind Me, I could hear Adrian launching into what sounded like a prepared statement about the sanctity of marriage and the importance of protecting creative professionals from corporate exploitation. My phone buzzed with a text from Savannah Lynn, my best friend and the venture capitalist who'd funded my company's series around coffee, wine, sledgehammer for his pretty face. Despite everything, I found myself smiling as I typed back, wine, your place, 1 hour. The ride to Savannah's Capitol Hill loft gave me time to process what had just happened. 3 years of marriage dissolved in favor of a piece of real estate. The house itself wasn't the issue. I could buy 10 similar properties without significantly impacting my portfolio. What stung was the methodical way Adrian had positioned himself to benefit from our relationship while maintaining plausible deniability about his motives. Savannah's building was a converted warehouse with exposed brick and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of Elliott Bay. She answered her door holding a bottle of Opus One and wearing the kind of cashmere sweater that cost more than most people's monthly rent. "How are you holding up?" she asked, leading me to her living room, where she'd already arranged a selection of takeout containers from our favorite Vietnamese restaurant. "I'm fine," I replied automatically, then caught her skeptical expression. "I'm processing." Savannah poured 2 generous glasses of wine and settled onto her white leather sectional. We'd known each other for 8 years, since our Stanford MBA program, and she'd developed an uncomfortable ability to read my emotional states, even when I thought I was hiding them effectively. He played it perfectly, I admitted, accepting. The wine, charming, vulnerable, just wounded enough to seem sympathetic without appearing weak. His legal team coached him well. His legal team, Savannah repeated thoughtfully. Brennan, Caldwell and Associates, top-tier corporate litigation firm. Interesting choice for a divorce proceeding. I looked at her sharply. Savannah's venture capital background had given her an encyclopedic knowledge of Seattle's professional networks, and she rarely made casual observations. Meaning Brennan Caldwell specializes in complex financial disputes, corporate takeovers, asset protection, international money transfers. Not exactly the typical skill set for dividing up household furniture and determining alimony payments. The implications settled over me like cold water. Adrian's legal representation suggested he'd been planning this divorce and its financial implications far more carefully than I'd realized. "There's something else," Savannah continued, pulling out her iPad and scrolling through what appeared to be financial documents. "I did some preliminary research on your house situation. The mortgage refinancing Adrian completed 6 months ago, it went through Cascade Private Banking." I frowned. I've never heard of them. Most people haven't. They're a boutique firm that specializes in high net worth clients and complex asset structures. The kind of place that asks very few questions as long as the collateral math works out. And Savannah's expression grew more serious. "And their parent company is a private equity firm called Northwest Maritime Holdings, which is owned by," she paused dramatically, "a consortium of investors that includes several developers who've been trying to acquire waterfront properties for luxury condo projects." The pieces began clicking into place with uncomfortable clarity. Adrian hadn't just taken our house, he'd potentially positioned it for sale to developers who would demolish it for high-rise construction. The home I'd carefully renovated, where I'd hosted dinner parties for Seattle's tech elite, where I'd naively imagined building a life with someone I'd trusted completely, was likely destined to become another generic luxury tower. "How do you know all this?" I asked. Savannah's smile was sharp. "Because Northwest Maritime Holdings approached my firm last year about funding their expansion into Seattle residential development. I turned them down because their business model seemed predatory, targeting older buildings and gentrifying neighborhoods, forcing out longtime residents, then building luxury units that price out the community." I set down my wine glass and walked to Savannah's floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city lights beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. Below us, Seattle's tech boom had transformed neighborhoods, displaced families, and created vast wealth for some, while leaving others struggling to afford the city they'd called home for decades. "He's not just taking the house," I said quietly. "He's planning to destroy it." "That would be my assessment," Savannah agreed. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" I turned back to face her, feeling something shift inside me, a familiar sensation from my early startup days when I'd identified a market opportunity that everyone else had overlooked. I'm going to buy them, I said. Savannah raised an eyebrow. By who? Northwest Maritime Holdings, the private equity firm. If they own Cascade Private Banking, and Cascade holds Adrian's mortgage, then controlling the parent company gives me leverage over his financing. For a moment, Savannah just stared at me. Then she began to laugh, not mockery, but genuine delight. Celia, she said, that's either brilliant or completely insane. In my experience, I replied, returning to the sectional and picking up my wine. The two aren't mutually exclusive. We spent the next 2 hours researching Northwest Maritime Holdings, mapping their ownership structure, identifying key shareholders, and calculating what it would take to acquire controlling interest. By the time I left Savannah's loft, we had the framework for what she kept calling the most expensive divorce revenge in Seattle history. But as I drove back to my temporary penthouse rental, a sterile furnished space that felt nothing like home, I realized this wasn't really about revenge. Adrian had taken something that belonged to me, yes, but more than that, he'd revealed himself to be part of a system that commodified homes, displaced communities, and treated people's lives as variables in financial equations. He'd made a crucial miscalculation in choosing me as his target. I wasn't just another successful woman he could manipulate and discard. I was someone who'd built a company by identifying inefficiencies in established systems and exploiting them ruthlessly. Adrian Royce had no idea what he'd just set in motion, but he was about to find out exactly who he'd been married to for 3 years. And I was about to remind him why underestimating me had always been everyone else's first and last mistake. Cascade Private Banking occupied the top 3 floors of a glass tower in South Lake Union, its understated elegance designed to whisper rather than shout about the wealth it managed. I arrived at precisely a.m. on a Tuesday morning, dressed in a navy Armani suit that struck the perfect balance between serious money and approachable professionalism. The lobby featured polished marble floors and abstract sculptures that probably cost more than most people's cars, but the overall effect was more sophisticated than ostentatious. Miss Tran, the receptionist, smiled warmly. Mr. Blake is expecting you. Owen Blake turned out to be nothing like what I'd expected from a private banking compliance officer. Instead of the gray-suited bureaucrat I'd imagined, he was younger than me, probably early 30s, with dark hair that looked like he'd run his fingers through it and intelligent eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. His office was organized to the point of obsession, with color-coded files and dual monitors displaying what appeared to be complex financial data streams. Thank you for meeting with me on such short notice, I said, settling into the chair across from his desk. I'm exploring private banking options, and Cascade came highly recommended. Owen's smile was cautious but genuine. We specialize in discretion and personalized service for high net worth individuals. What specifically brings you to us? I'd rehearsed this conversation carefully with Savannah, crafting an approach that would allow me to gather information without triggering compliance red flags. I'm in the process of restructuring my investment portfolio following some recent life changes, I said, letting a hint of vulnerability creep into my voice. I need banking partners who understand complex asset situations. Life changes can certainly complicate financial planning, Owen agreed sympathetically. What sort of complexity are we discussing? Divorce, I replied simply, watching his expression shift to professional concern. My ex-husband retained ownership of our primary residence, but I'm curious about the mortgage structure he used. It affects some of my tax planning. Owen leaned back slightly, his compliance training clearly kicking in. I'm afraid I can't discuss specific client information, even with a former spouse. Of course not, I said quickly. I'm not asking for account details. I'm more interested in understanding your mortgage products in general. The property is in Belltown 2847 Western Avenue, and I believe the financing went through Cascade about 6 months ago. Something flickered across Owen's face at the address, but he maintained his professional composure. We do handle residential mortgages for qualifying clients, though our minimum loan amounts tend to be higher than traditional banks. Higher? How? We typically don't write mortgages under $2 million, Owen said. Our clients usually have complex income streams that require specialized underwriting approaches. I nodded thoughtfully. That makes sense. I imagine the documentation requirements are quite extensive. Very, Owen agreed, then paused as if weighing his words carefully. We've actually been implementing enhanced verification procedures. Recently, some irregularities in the market have required additional scrutiny. The way he said irregularities sent a small thrill through me. What sort of irregularities? Owen glanced at his office door, then lowered his voice slightly. Between you and me, we've seen an increase in fraudulent documentation, forged income statements, manipulated asset valuations, even fake employment verification. It's become a significant compliance concern. Has this affected any of your current mortgage holders? I really can't discuss specific cases, Owen said, but his discomfort was obvious. Let's focus on your needs. What sort of banking relationship are you looking to establish? I spent the next 30 minutes outlining a carefully crafted financial profile that positioned me as exactly the kind of client Cascade would want: significant liquid assets, multiple income streams, international business interests that required sophisticated banking services. Owen took detailed notes, asking increasingly technical questions about my fintech company and investment portfolio. Your business model is fascinating, he said, reviewing his notes. Payment processing with integrated fraud detection. I imagine you see a lot of financial irregularities yourself. More than you'd expect, I replied. It's given me a healthy skepticism about documentation that looks too perfect. In my experience, legitimate transactions have a certain messiness to them. Real businesses have cash flow variations, seasonal fluctuations, unexpected expenses. When everything looks completely polished, that's usually when I start digging deeper. Owen's expression grew more interested. That's a remarkably sophisticated perspective. Most clients prefer their finances to appear seamless. Seamless is good for presentation, but it's terrible for compliance, I said. The best fraud prevention systems look for patterns that are too clean to consistent. Real life is messier. You know, Owen said slowly, we should continue this conversation. Would you be interested in joining me for coffee? There's a place downstairs that's much more comfortable than this office. 20 minutes later, we sat in a corner booth at a quiet cafe in the building's ground floor, our conversation having shifted from my banking needs to a more philosophical discussion about financial ethics and compliance challenges. The problem with private banking, Owen said, stirring his espresso, is that our clients often have complex situations that push right up against regulatory boundaries. It's my job to ensure we stay on the right side of those boundaries. That must create interesting ethical dilemmas, I observed. More than I'd like, Owen admitted. Take mortgage fraud, for example. Sometimes clients present documentation that's technically accurate but fundamentally misleading. They'll create shell companies to inflate their income, or use complicated asset structures to hide liabilities. It's not illegal exactly, but it violates the spirit of responsible lending. Have you encountered situations like that recently? I asked carefully. Owen was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with compliance protocols versus what seemed to be a genuine desire to discuss these issues with someone who understood the complexities involved. There's a case I've been reviewing, he said. Finally, a residential mortgage where the borrower's financial profile has some concerning elements. The documentation is technically compliant, but when I run it through our enhanced verification protocols, red flags appear. What sort of red flags? Income sources that can't be independently verified, asset valuations that seem inflated, business partnerships with entities that have no apparent operational history. Owen paused. The most concerning element is a second mortgage application that was submitted using what appears to be forged power of attorney documentation. My pulse quickened, but I kept my expression neutral. Forged how? Digital signature analysis suggests the document was created using software rather than actually signed by the named party. The metadata shows creation dates that don't align with the claimed signing date. It's sophisticated work, but not sophisticated enough to fool our new verification systems. What happens in cases like that? Normally, we'd freeze the account, pending investigation, and report the potential fraud to regulatory authorities, Owen said. But this particular case involves a prominent local architect with significant media connections. My supervisors are reluctant to move without absolutely conclusive proof. I felt pieces clicking into place. So the account remains active? For now, Owen said, his frustration evident. Though I've been documenting everything carefully, if additional irregularities surface, we'll have grounds for immediate action. What would constitute additional irregularities? Owen met my eyes directly for the first time during our conversation. Evidence of systematic fraud. Proof that the borrower has engaged in similar behavior with other financial institutions. Documentation showing that the forged power of attorney was used to manipulate assets belonging to someone else. The message was clear. Owen suspected Adrian of fraud but needed additional evidence to overcome his supervisor's reluctance to act against a high-profile client. "You know," I said carefully, "my fintech company has developed some interesting tools for detecting financial fraud. We specialize in pattern recognition across multiple institutions and account types. If you ever needed to verify suspicious activity through external data sources, I might be able to help." "That could be very valuable," Owen replied, "especially if we were dealing with someone who had systematically defrauded multiple parties." We finished our coffee in companionable silence, both understanding that we'd established the foundation for a mutually beneficial relationship. Owen needed evidence to build his fraud case, and I needed insider access to Adrian's financial vulnerabilities. As we prepared to leave, Owen handed me his business card with a handwritten addition on the back, his personal cell phone number. "Please don't hesitate to call if you have questions about our services," he said formally. Then, lowering his voice, "or if you come across information that might be relevant to our compliance procedures." I returned to my temporary penthouse that afternoon with a clear understanding of the battlefield. Adrian had used forged documents to secure a second mortgage on our house, likely to fund whatever schemes he was running with the development consortium Savannah had identified. Owen Blake was positioned to help me expose the fraud, but he needed political cover to move against a prominent client. The solution was elegant in its simplicity. I needed to become not just a client of Cascade Private Banking, but a stakeholder in Northwest Maritime Holdings. With sufficient ownership position, I could push for enhanced compliance procedures that would inevitably uncover Adrian's fraudulent activities. I called Savannah immediately. "How quickly can we move on Northwest Maritime?" I asked without preamble. "Depends on how much you're willing to spend and how discreet you want the acquisition to be," she replied. "Why? Did you find something at the bank?" "Adrian used forged documents to secure a second mortgage," I said. "The compliance officer knows it but can't act without better political positioning. If I control enough of the parent company, I can ensure the investigation moves forward." "Jesus, Celia, when you decide to play hardball, you don't mess around." Savannah paused. "Give me 48 hours. I'll put together an acquisition strategy that keeps your involvement invisible until we're ready to reveal it." That evening, I sat in my sterile rental apartment reviewing the financial documents Savannah had compiled on Northwest Maritime Holdings, the private equity firm controlled to $8 billion in assets, primarily focused on real estate development and hospitality investments. Their ownership structure was deliberately complex, with shares distributed among dozens of limited partners and holding companies. But complex ownership structures were exactly the kind of puzzle I'd learned to solve during my years building a fintech company. Every seemingly impenetrable corporate labyrinth had weak points, key shareholders who could be persuaded to sell, board members who could be influenced. Adrian had chosen his battlefield poorly. He'd tried to outmaneuver me in the realm of financial manipulation, apparently forgetting that I'd built my career on understanding exactly these kinds of systems. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Spoke with supervisors about enhanced verification protocols. Meeting scheduled for Thursday to discuss implementation timeline. Oh, and I smiled, pouring myself a glass of wine and returning to the financial documents spread across my dining table. By Thursday, I wanted to have a clear picture of how to acquire controlling interest in Northwest Maritime Holdings. By the end of the month, I wanted to own the bank that held Adrian's fraudulent mortgage. Adrian had taken my house, but he'd underestimated both my resources and my willingness to use them. He was about to learn that the quiet, accommodating wife he'd manipulated for 3 years had been replaced by someone far more dangerous, a tech entrepreneur with unlimited funds and a comprehensive understanding of financial systems. The mortgage game was just beginning, and I intended to win. Savannah's office at Lynn Ventures occupied an entire floor of the Columbia Center, with windows that offered a commanding view of Elliott Bay and the Olympic Mountains beyond. When I arrived at AM on Thursday morning, she was already at her standing desk, surrounded by multiple monitors displaying what appeared to be complex corporate ownership charts and financial flow diagrams. Tell me you have good news, I said, accepting the cup of Vietnamese coffee she handed me. Better than good, Savannah replied, gesturing to her screens. Northwest Maritime Holdings is more vulnerable than we initially thought. They've been aggressively leveraging their portfolio to fund expansion, which means they need cash flow to service debt obligations. More importantly, 3 of their major limited partners are pension funds that have been under pressure to divest from controversial real estate projects. She pulled up a detailed organizational chart that looked like a spider web of interconnected entities. The key is Meridian Capital Management, she said, pointing to a box near the center. They control 23% of Northwest Maritime through a series of investment vehicles. Meridian's managing partner, David Chen, has been quietly shopping their stake for the past 6 months. Why quietly? Because Meridian got burned on a high-profile development scandal in Vancouver last year. Forced displacement of low-income residents, environmental violations, bribery allegations. They're trying to clean up their portfolio before it affects their other investments. I studied the chart, following the lines that connected Meridian to Northwest Maritime to Cascade Private Banking to Adrian's mortgage. How much would it cost to acquire Meridian's position? Chen's asking price is $180 million for the full stake, Savannah said. But here's where it gets interesting. Meridian's position gives them 2 board seats on Northwest Maritime's executive committee. Those seats come with oversight authority over major lending decisions at Cascade. The implications were immediately clear. With control of Meridian's stake, I wouldn't just be a passive investor, I'd have direct influence over the bank's operations and compliance procedures. There's more, Savannah continued, pulling up another screen. I've been digging into the other development projects Northwest Maritime has funded through Cascade. Your ex-husband isn't their only questionable client. She showed me a list of recent mortgage approvals, each one representing millions of dollars in loans to developers working on controversial projects around the city. Look at this pattern: historic district demolitions, zoning variance approvals that happened unusually fast, community opposition that mysteriously disappeared after initial protests. Bribery? That would be my assessment. And if there's systematic corruption in Northwest Maritime's lending practices, it's not just Adrian who's vulnerable, it's the entire network. My phone buzzed with a text from Owen. Enhanced verification meeting moved to PM. Discovered additional irregularities in target account. May need external forensic analysis. I showed the message to Savannah, who smiled grimly. Your compliance officer is moving faster than expected. We should accelerate the acquisition timeline. How fast can we move on Meridian? If you're willing to pay Chen's asking price without negotiation, we could have preliminary agreements signed by Monday, Savannah said. The real question is whether you want to keep your involvement secret until the deal closes. I considered the strategic implications. Revealing my identity too early would alert Adrian and potentially cause him to transfer assets or flee. But maintaining anonymity would limit my ability to direct the investigation once I gain board seats. Set up a shell company, I decided. Something that can't be easily traced back to me but gives us operational flexibility once the acquisition is complete. Savannah nodded approvingly. I'll use Cayman Islands Incorporation with nominee directors. Clean, legal, and virtually impossible to penetrate without significant resources. She began typing rapidly, coordinating with what I assumed were lawyers and financial advisors. While she worked, I reviewed the additional mortgage files she'd compiled, looking for patterns that might help Owen build his fraud case. What I found was more systematic than I'd expected. Over the past 2 years, Cascade had approved nearly $200 million in loans to developers working on projects that shared certain characteristics. They all involved demolishing existing buildings in gentrifying neighborhoods. They all required complex zoning variances that had been approved with unusual speed, and they all were connected to shell companies that traced back to a single consulting firm called Pacific Northwest Development Services. Savannah, I said slowly. Have you heard of Pacific Northwest Development Services? She looked up from her typing. Should I have? They're listed as the consulting firm for every problematic development project Northwest Maritime has funded. Look at this: 12 different developers, all using the same consultant, all getting approved for loans despite questionable documentation. Savannah pulled up her own research databases, her fingers flying across the keyboard. Pacific Northwest Development Services, she murmured. Incorporated in Delaware 18 months ago, Principal address is a mail forwarding service in Bellevue. No significant web presence. No listed employees beyond the registered agent. Shell company? Almost certainly. But shell companies have to pay someone for services, which means there's a money trail. She paused, scrolling through financial records. Got it. Pacific Northwest Development Services has been paying consulting fees to Royce Architecture Group. The connection hit me like cold water. Adrian's firm. More than that, Savannah said, her voice growing excited. Look at the payment schedule. Pacific Northwest has paid Royce Architecture Group over $3 million in consulting fees over the past 18 months. That's not architecture work, that's systematic coordination of a development scheme. I felt the familiar thrill of discovering a critical piece of a complex puzzle. Adrian wasn't just committing mortgage fraud, he was operating as the central coordinator for a network of developers who were systematically gaming Seattle's zoning and approval processes. We need to get this information to Owen immediately, I said, and we need someone who can investigate the broader corruption implications. Savannah was already reaching for her phone. I know exactly who to call. An hour later, we sat in a small cafe in Pike Place Market with Renata Vale, an investigative journalist whose reputation for exposing municipal corruption had made her both feared and respected throughout the Northwest. Renata was younger than I'd expected, probably mid-30s, with sharp eyes and the kind of understated intensity that suggested she was constantly evaluating everything around her for potential story angles. You're asking me to investigate systematic municipal corruption based on anonymous tips, Renata said, reviewing the documents we'd prepared. That's either the story of the year or an elaborate setup designed to destroy someone's reputation. What would convince you it's legitimate? I asked. Renata studied my face carefully. Full financial records for Pacific Northwest Development Services. Documentation of the zoning approval timeline for these projects compared to similar proposals that were rejected. And most importantly, evidence of cash payments or other benefits flowing to city officials who approved these variances. And if we could provide that information, then you'd have my full attention, Renata replied. But I'd need to verify everything independently. I can't afford to publish another story based on questionable sources. There was something in her tone that suggested she'd been burned before, possibly badly enough to damage her credibility. I made a mental note to research her recent work and understand what kind of professional pressures she might be facing. Give us a week, Savannah said. If we can provide the documentation you need, will you investigate the full scope of the corruption? If the evidence supports it, yes, Renata agreed. But I want to understand why you're bringing this to me. What's your interest in exposing this particular scheme? I'd prepared for this question, crafting an answer that was truthful but incomplete. I'm concerned about the impact these developments are having on Seattle's historic neighborhoods. The pattern of demolitions and luxury construction is displacing longtime residents and destroying the character of communities that took decades to build. Renata nodded slowly. That's a good answer, but it doesn't explain why you're willing to spend significant resources investigating private banking irregularities. This isn't casual civic concern, this is serious money and serious legal risk. Sometimes doing the right thing requires taking serious risks, I replied. Fair enough, Renata said, gathering her copies of the documents. But if this turns out to be personal vendetta disguised as public interest journalism, I'll make sure that story gets told too. After Renata left Savannah and I returned to her office to finalize the Meridian acquisition strategy, David Chen had agreed to an accelerated timeline, and his attorneys were already preparing the necessary documentation for a Friday closing. Once we control Meridian's stake, what's our first move? Savannah asked. Board meeting, I replied. I want Owen's enhanced verification procedures implemented immediately, with specific focus on the loans we've identified as problematic. If Adrian and his network are systematically defrauding the bank, we're going to document every transaction and every relationship. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. My phone rang with a call from Owen. The additional irregularities I mentioned, he said without preamble, they're worse than I initially thought. The borrower appears to have used the same forged power of attorney documents to access accounts belonging to his ex-wife. What kind of accounts? Investment accounts, business banking relationships, even what appears to be unauthorized access to her company's financial records. If I'm reading this correctly, He's been systematically stealing from her for months. The personal violation was staggering, but the strategic implications were even more significant. Adrian hadn't just committed mortgage fraud, he'd engaged in identity theft and corporate espionage against my company. How quickly can you compile a complete report? I asked. I've been documenting everything as I discovered it, Owen replied. Give me until tomorrow and I'll have a comprehensive analysis ready for review. Good. There may be some changes in the bank's ownership structure next week. That will give you additional support for moving forward with the investigation. Changes? Let's just say that enhanced compliance procedures are about to become a much higher priority for Northwest Maritime Holdings. That evening, I sat in my temporary apartment reviewing everything we'd uncovered over the past week. Adrian's scheme was more elaborate and more damaging than I'd initially realized. He'd positioned himself as the coordinator for a systematic assault on Seattle's zoning processes, using forged documents to steal from me personally and manipulating multiple financial institutions to fund his network of corrupt developers. But he'd also made a critical error. He'd created a paper trail that connected him to every aspect of the scheme. Owen had the banking evidence. Renata would soon have the municipal corruption documentation. And I was about to control the financial institution that could freeze his assets and expose his entire network. Adrian had spent our marriage positioning himself as the charming, creative partner while I focused on building my business. He'd convinced me that he was the dreamer while I was the pragmatist, that he brought beauty to my world while I provided the financial foundation for his artistic vision. What he'd never understood was that my pragmatism wasn't just about making money, it was about understanding systems well enough to make them work for me. And now that I understood his system, I was going to dismantle it piece by piece, starting with the bank that had made his scheme possible. By Monday morning, I would own enough of Northwest Maritime Holdings to ensure that Adrian's financial empire began crumbling from within. And unlike his carefully orchestrated public relations campaign during our divorce, this collapse would be impossible to spin as anything other than what it was: the consequences of systematic fraud finally catching up with someone who'd underestimated the woman he'd tried to destroy. The phone call from Grace came at 6:47 a.m. on Monday morning, just as I was reviewing the final Meridian acquisition documents that would be signed in 3 hours. My younger sister's voice carried the particular tension I remembered from our childhood, whenever she'd discovered some injustice that required immediate action. Celia, I need you to look at something, Grace said without preamble. Can you meet me at my office in an hour? Grace Tran worked for the Northwest Legal Advocacy Center in a converted warehouse in Georgetown, where her nonprofit organization provided legal services to low-income residents facing displacement and housing discrimination. I'd always admired her commitment to social justice, though our relationship had been strained during my marriage to Adrian, who'd made pointed comments about Grace's impractical idealism whenever she visited. The Advocacy Center's offices reflected Grace's priorities: functional furniture, walls covered with maps showing gentrification patterns across Seattle, and a coffee station that looked like it had been assembled from second-hand equipment. Grace herself appeared to have been working all night, her usually immaculate appearance replaced by wrinkled clothes and the intense focus I recognized from law school study sessions. Mrs. Elena Vasquez, Grace said, sliding a file folder across her desk. 73 years old, owned a small house in the International District for 42 years. Last month, she received notice that her property had been sold and she had 30 days to vacate. I opened the folder, reviewing documentation. That immediately triggered my legal training. She didn't sign the sale documents? That's what she claims. Mrs. Vasquez speaks limited English, but she's completely lucid and absolutely certain she never agreed to sell her home. The problem is that the documentation appears to be legally valid notarized deed transfer, power of attorney authorization, even bank records showing payment deposited into an account supposedly belonging to her. The similarities to what Owen had discovered about Adrian's mortgage fraud were immediately apparent. Forged signatures? That's my assessment, but proving it requires resources we don't have, Grace said, her frustration evident. Digital, forensic analysis, handwriting experts, financial auditing, the kind of investigation that costs more than our entire annual budget. I studied the documents more carefully, noting the notary stamps and the bank routing information. What's the name of the company that purchased the property? Emerald City Development LLC, Grace replied. shell company incorporated in Delaware, managed by a local consulting firm called Pacific Northwest Development Services. The connection hit me like electricity. Grace, this is connected to something much larger than Mrs. Vasquez's case. How many similar situations have you seen recently? 7 confirmed cases in the past 6 months, Grace said, pulling out additional files. All elderly homeowners, all in neighborhoods targeted for redevelopment, all involving property sales. They claim they never authorized. I spent the next hour reviewing each case, finding the same pattern: sophisticated forged documentation, shell company purchases, and Pacific Northwest Development Services coordinating the transactions. Mrs. Vasquez and the other victims weren't just isolated fraud cases, they were targets in Adrian's systematic scheme to clear properties for luxury development. Grace, I need you to trust me, I said, closing the files. I can provide the resources for forensic investigation, but I need you to keep my involvement confidential for now. Why? Grace's expression was skeptical. What aren't you telling me? I'd avoided discussing my divorce with Grace in detail, partly because her opinions about Adrian had been uncomfortably accurate, and partly because I'd been too proud to admit how thoroughly I'd been manipulated. But Mrs. Vasquez's case made my personal situation inseparable from Grace's advocacy work. Adrian is involved, I said simply. The consulting firm coordinating these property thefts is connected to his architecture firm. The fraud techniques being used are the same ones he used to steal from me during our divorce. Grace's expression shifted from skepticism to recognition. The prenup situation. You never explained how he managed to claim sole ownership of a house you funded. Forged power of attorney documents, I replied. The same technique used against Mrs. Vasquez and the others. Adrian has been systematically defrauding vulnerable property owners to clear land for luxury developments. Jesus, Celia, why didn't you tell me this sooner? Because I needed to understand the full scope before involving anyone else. And because I knew you'd want to take immediate action that might compromise a larger investigation. Grace leaned back in her chair, processing the implications. What kind of larger investigation? I explained about Owen's discovery of the mortgage fraud, Savannah's research into Northwest Maritime Holdings, and my plans to acquire controlling interest in the private equity firm. Grace listened with the same intense focus she'd shown during law school, asking pointed questions about legal strategies and potential criminal charges. So you're planning to expose Adrian's entire network from the inside, Grace said finally. That's either brilliant or completely insane. Savannah said the same thing, I replied. But consider the alternative: we report what we know to law enforcement and hope they can build cases against defendants with significant financial resources and political connections. How long would that take? And how many more people like Mrs. Vasquez would lose their homes while we wait for justice? Grace nodded slowly. What do you need from me? Full documentation on all 7 cases, plus any others you identify. I want to present Renata Vale with a comprehensive pattern of fraud that she can investigate publicly while I work on the financial side. Renata Vale from the Seattle Post-Intelligencer? I thought she was blacklisted after that corruption story fell apart. She's freelancing now, and she's hungry to rebuild her credibility with a solid story. The municipal corruption angle combined with the banking fraud gives her multiple entry points for investigation. Grace gathered the files, adding contact information for the affected homeowners. Mrs. Vasquez will talk to her if I vouch for the journalist, but some of the others are afraid of immigration consequences if they get involved with media attention. Renata's good at protecting sources, I said. And if this goes the way I think it will, immigration status won't matter. The evidence of fraud will be so overwhelming that the focus will be on the perpetrators, not the victims. My phone buzzed with a text from Savannah. Meridian signing complete. Board seats transfer effective immediately. Welcome to bank ownership. I have to go, I told Grace, standing and gathering my purse. But let's have dinner tonight. I want to hear about your work, and I think we need to rebuild our relationship. Grace smiled for the first time since I'd arrived. I'd like that. And Celia, I'm sorry about what happened with Adrian. I should have said something earlier about my concerns. You did say something, I replied. I just wasn't ready to listen. The Meridian Capital Management offices occupied a subdued suite in the Madison Center, designed to project stability rather than flash. David Chen turned out to be a soft-spoken man in his 50s who seemed genuinely relieved to be divesting From Northwest Maritime Holdings. The Vancouver situation was a nightmare, he explained as we signed the final transfer documents. Community protests, regulatory investigations, media scrutiny that lasted for months. We've been trying to clean up our portfolio ever since. Any particular concerns about Northwest Maritime's operations? I asked carefully. Chen paused, choosing his words diplomatically. They're aggressive about expansion, sometimes to the point of ignoring community impact. We've been uncomfortable with some of their recent development partnerships, such as projects that seem to require unusual amounts of political coordination, zoning variances that get approved despite significant opposition, the kind of situations that attract unwanted attention from journalists and regulatory agencies. The irony wasn't lost on me. Chen was describing exactly the kind of corruption I was planning to expose, but from the perspective of an investor, worried about reputational risk rather than social impact. I appreciate your candor, I said. I'm hoping to bring a different perspective to Northwest Maritime's board oversight. Good luck, Chen replied, shaking my hand as the lawyers completed the paperwork. You'll need it. 3 hours later, I sat in the Northwest Maritime Holdings boardroom for my first executive committee meeting as a controlling shareholder. The other board members, primarily older men in expensive suits, seemed curious about the new investor who'd acquired Meridian's stake so quickly. Miss Chen, said Robert Ashford, Northwest Maritime's chairman, using the surname from my shell company incorporation, we're pleased to welcome Pacific Rim Holdings as a new partner. Perhaps you could share your investment thesis for our real estate portfolio? I clicked to the next slide, showing a network diagram that connected shell companies to development projects without naming specific entities. The fraud appears to be coordinated through a single consulting firm that has facilitated questionable transactions across multiple borrower accounts. This firm has received over $3 million in payments from entities that have obtained loans through Cascade despite providing falsified documentation. Margaret Thornfield was studying the presentation intently. What are you recommending? Immediate implementation of enhanced verification protocols for all loans exceeding $1 million, I said. Systematic review of existing accounts showing irregularities. And most importantly, board authorization for our compliance team to freeze accounts pending investigation. When fraud indicators are identified, freeze accounts? Morrison looked alarmed. That seems extreme. What about borrower relationships? Reputation concerns? What about fiduciary responsibility? I countered. If we're aware of potential fraud and fail to act, board members could face personal liability for enabling criminal activity. The legal implications weren't lost on anyone in the room. Private equity board members took personal liability seriously, especially when criminal exposure was involved. I motioned for a vote on implementing Ms. Chen's recommendations immediately, said David Kellner, Northwest Maritime's newest board member, and someone I'd researched as potentially sympathetic to stronger oversight. Seconded, Margaret Thornfield added quickly. The motion passed unanimously, though I could tell from several members' expressions that they were hoping the enhanced procedures would prove the irregularities were isolated incidents rather than systematic problems. There's one additional matter, I said as the meeting concluded. Given the complexity of this review, I recommend appointing a special oversight committee with authority to direct the investigation and report findings directly to this board. Who would serve on such a committee? Ashford asked. I'd be willing to chair it, I replied, along with Ms. Thornfield and any other board members with relevant compliance experience. The oversight committee was approved with minimal discussion, effectively giving me direct authority over the investigation that would expose Adrian's entire network. As board members filed out of the conference room, I remained behind to coordinate with Owen, who'd been waiting in Cascade's compliance department for authorization to begin the comprehensive review. We have full board support, I told him. Over the phone, you can begin freezing accounts immediately. Starting with the target account we discussed? Owen asked. Starting with any account showing evidence of fraudulent documentation, I replied. Let the evidence guide the investigation, not personal considerations. Within 2 hours, Owen had frozen Adrian's mortgage account along with 6 others connected to Pacific Northwest Development Services. The freezes were implemented quietly, designed to prevent asset transfers while appearing to be routine compliance procedures. Adrian wouldn't discover the freeze until he attempted to access funds or make payments, giving us time to build a comprehensive case before he could react. I was reviewing Owen's initial findings when Savannah called with concerning news. Adrian just retained Blackstone and Associates, she said without preamble. Top-tier crisis management firms specializing in white-collar defense. Either he's anticipating problems, or he's already discovered them. How do you know? My assistant used to work for Blackstone's managing partner. She saw Adrian leaving their offices this morning looking like he'd seen a ghost. The timeline was troubling. We'd implemented the account freezes less than 3 hours ago, and Adrian was already consulting criminal defense attorneys. Either he had inside information about our investigation or his paranoia had reached the point where he was taking preemptive action. There's more, Savannah continued. Blackstone's specialty isn't just criminal defense, they handle reputation management for high-profile clients facing public exposure. They're the firm that managed damage control for that tech CEO who got caught insider trading last year. Meaning Adrian is preparing for public scrutiny? Meaning he's preparing for war, Savannah replied. If he's hiring Blackstone, he's not planning to quietly accept whatever consequences we uncover. He's going to fight back aggressively. I spent the afternoon coordinating with Grace and Renata, accelerating our timeline for public exposure. Before Adrian could launch a preemptive counterattack, Grace had compiled documentation from 12 elderly homeowners who'd been victimized by forged property transfers, while Renata had confirmed municipal corruption in the zoning approval process for developments connected to Adrian's consulting network. The pattern is undeniable, Renata said during our conference call. Fast-tracked approvals for projects that should have required months of community review, bribes disguised as consulting fees paid to city officials, and systematic intimidation of community groups that oppose the developments. How quickly can you publish? I asked. I need another week to verify the financial connections and get comments from the officials involved, Renata replied. But if Adrian is already hiring crisis management, we might not have a week before he starts his own media campaign. What kind of media campaign? Classic strategy, Renata explained. Get ahead of negative coverage by controlling the narrative. He'll probably claim he's being targeted by vindictive ex-spouse, paint himself as successful businessman being destroyed by false accusations, maybe even suggest the real corruption involves people trying to frame him. The irony was perfect. Adrian was planning to use the same victimization narrative he'd employed during our divorce, except this time he'd be fighting documented evidence of systematic criminal activity rather than sympathetic family court proceedings. Can you publish a preliminary story establishing the basic facts before he launches his defense? I asked. If you can provide documentation showing the financial connections between the shell companies and the municipal corruption, yes, Renata said. But it needs to be bulletproof. If I publish allegations that turn out to be wrong, it destroys my credibility permanently. After the call, I drove to Mrs. Vasquez's house in the International District, wanting to see firsthand the community that Adrian's scheme was designed to destroy. The neighborhood was a mixture of older immigrant families, young professionals attracted by affordable housing, and small businesses that had served the community for decades. Mrs. Vasquez's house was a small craftsman bungalow with a well-maintained garden and the kind of careful attention to detail that suggested someone who'd invested decades in making it home. Grace met me at the front door, introducing me to a woman whose dignified bearing couldn't entirely mask her fear about losing the property she'd worked 42 years to own. She wants to fight, Grace told me as we sat in Mrs. Vasquez's living room, surrounded by family photos spanning for decades. But she's worried about the legal costs and whether anyone will believe her word against official documents. Through Grace's translation, I assured Mrs. Vasquez that she'd have whatever legal representation she needed and that her case was part of a larger investigation that would hold the perpetrators accountable. What struck me most was her quiet determination. She wasn't asking for charity or expressing victimization, just requesting the opportunity to defend what was rightfully hers. Tell her, I said to Grace, that by tomorrow morning, the people who tried to steal her house will discover they've made a serious mistake. As we left Mrs. Vasquez's house, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. We need to talk. Important information about mutual interests. A concerned party. The message could have been spam, a trap, or legitimate contact from someone with information about Adrian's activities. But the timing just hours after implementing the account freezes suggested it was connected to our investigation. Forward that to Owen and ask him to trace the number, I told Grace. If someone wants to provide information about Adrian's activities, they can do it through proper channels with appropriate verification. That evening, I returned to my temporary apartment to find a manila envelope that had been slipped under my door. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a handwritten note. The consulting firm is just the beginning. Check the architectural drawings filed with the city for the Belltown project. Pay attention to the signature dates. Someone who knows what you're trying to accomplish. I photographed the note and immediately called Owen. Can you access city planning records remotely? Depends on what you're looking for, Owen replied. Most building permits and architectural filings are public record, but they're not always digitized. Belltown Development Project connected to Pacific Northwest Development Services. I need to see the architectural drawings, specifically the signature dates. Give me an hour, Owen said. If there's something significant in those records, I'll find it. While I waited, I reviewed everything we'd uncovered about Adrian's scheme, looking for connections I might have missed. The municipal corruption, the banking fraud, the property theft targeting elderly homeowners, all of it was interconnected. But there were still pieces missing. Owen called back with findings that explained the anonymous note. The architectural drawings for the Belltown project were filed with the city 8 months before Adrian's firm was officially hired as the consulting architect. Either he submitted work speculatively, or he knew about the project before it was publicly announced. Meaning he had inside information about city planning decisions before they were made, Owen replied. That's not just corruption, that's evidence of a conspiracy involving city officials who provided advance notice of zoning changes and development opportunities. The implications were staggering. Adrian hadn't just been opportunistically exploiting vulnerable homeowners, he'd been working with corrupt city officials to identify properties for forced acquisition before the development plans were even publicly announced. Owen, I said, tomorrow morning I want every account connected to this scheme frozen. No more careful procedures. No more gradual investigation. If Adrian is preparing for war, we're going to give him one. Are you sure? Once we freeze everything simultaneously, there's no hiding our investigation. I'm done hiding, I replied. It's time for Adrian to discover exactly what happens when he tries to destroy the wrong person. The Seattle Art Museum's Spring Gala was exactly the kind of event Adrian would attend, high profile enough to enhance his public image, exclusive enough to feed his ego, and filled with the kind of wealthy clients who might fund his next architectural project. I'd purchased my ticket 3 days earlier, not as part of my investigation but as an opportunity to gauge how much he suspected about the financial pressure that was beginning to close around him. I arrived at the museum fashionably late, wearing a midnight blue silk gown that struck the perfect balance between elegant and understated. The main gallery had been transformed for the evening, with dramatic lighting that highlighted both the permanent collection and the carefully curated guest list of Seattle's cultural elite. Adrian was holding court near the Kusama installation, surrounded by a small group of admirers that included 2 city council members, a prominent developer I recognized from news coverage, and his current girlfriend, a blonde curator from a private gallery whose name I couldn't remember. He looked exactly as he had during our marriage, impeccably dressed, radiating the kind of effortless charm that made people want to be in his orbit, gesturing expressively as he told what was undoubtedly a perfectly crafted anecdote. Celia, Tran, a voice behind me said warmly. I was hoping you'd be here tonight. I turned to find Marcus Reynolds, the tech entrepreneur who'd tried to acquire my company 2 years earlier. Marcus was intelligent, wealthy, and possessed the kind of understated confidence that came from building something significant without needing constant validation. Marcus, I replied, accepting the glass of champagne he offered. How's the venture capital world treating you? Can't complain, he said, his eyes following my gaze toward Adrian's group. Though I have to ask, are you planning to avoid that corner of the room all evening? Or is this strategic positioning? I smiled despite myself. Marcus had always been perceptive about social dynamics. Strategic, I admitted. I'm curious to see how my ex-husband handles certain pressures he might be experiencing. Business pressures? Let's call them regulatory challenges, I replied carefully. We spent the next hour circulating through the gallery, discussing art and technology, while I observed Adrian's interactions. What I noticed was subtle but telling. His smile seemed slightly forced. He checked his phone more frequently than usual, and twice I saw him step away from conversations to take calls that lasted longer than social politeness normally allowed. He seems tense, Marcus observed as we watched Adrian excuse himself for another phone call. Not the usual confident architect persona. Perhaps he's discovering that charm has its limitations, I replied. At that moment, Adrian finished his call and looked directly at me across the gallery. For a few seconds, we simply stared at each other, the first time we'd made eye contact since the divorce proceedings. Then he smiled, said something to his companions, and began walking toward me with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested he'd made a decision. Celia, he said warmly, as if we were old friends encountering each other at a pleasant social gathering. You look beautiful. I didn't expect to see you here. Adrian, I replied with equal pleasantness. How nice. I was just telling Marcus about your latest projects. Still working on that Belltown development? Something flickered across his expression, too quick for most people to notice, but I'd learned to read his micro-expressions during 3 years of marriage. Among other things, he said, you know how it is in architecture, multiple projects, complex timelines. Complex indeed, I agreed, especially when they involve so many different partners. Would you excuse us for a moment, Marcus? Adrian asked, his tone remaining friendly while his eyes stayed fixed on mine. I'd love to catch up with Celia privately. Marcus glanced between us, clearly sensing undercurrents he didn't understand. Of course, Celia. I'll find you later. Adrian guided me toward a quieter corner of the gallery, near a series of contemporary paintings that provided both privacy and good acoustics for conversation. Up close, I could see the subtle signs of stress that his public persona had been concealing, slight tension around his eyes, the kind of careful posture that suggested he was working to appear relaxed. You're looking well, he said, his voice carrying the intimate tone he'd once used during private conversations. I've been thinking about you. Have you? I replied, allowing a hint of warmth into my response. That's unexpected. The divorce was difficult for both of us, Adrian continued, moving slightly closer. I know things got complicated, but I never stopped caring about you. It was masterfully done, the careful vulnerability, the suggestion of regret without actual apology, the implication that we were both victims of circumstances rather than his calculated manipulation. I recognized the technique because I'd fallen for it repeatedly during our marriage. Adrian, I said softly, are you trying to seduce me in the middle of an art gallery? His smile was genuinely charming. Would that work? It might, I replied, letting my fingers brush against his arm. If I didn't know you so well. You do know me, he said, his voice dropping to the intimate register that had once made me feel like the only person in the room. Better than anyone else ever has. The irony was perfect. Adrian thought he was manipulating me using our former intimacy, unaware that I was using the same connection to gauge exactly how much pressure he was feeling and how desperate his situation had become. Are you happy? I asked, studying his face carefully. With your new life, your new projects? Happiness is complicated, Adrian replied. Success has its own challenges. Financial pressures, partnership disagreements, regulatory scrutiny that seems designed to punish innovation. There it was, the admission that he was experiencing the kind of regulatory attention that would only occur if someone had filed complaints or initiated investigations. Owen's compliance review was clearly having its intended effect. Regulatory scrutiny? I asked with just the right note of concern. That sounds stressful. Banking regulations have become impossibly complex, Adrian said, his frustration momentarily breaking through his careful composure. Compliance officers who seem more interested in creating problems than facilitating legitimate business. It's as if someone has decided to target successful professionals for political reasons. Someone? Adrian's expression grew more speculative. Competition can make people vindictive, especially in industries where success breeds resentment. I've heard rumors about investors using regulatory pressure to force out competitors. I nodded sympathetically. That does sound concerning. Have you considered hiring additional legal representation? Someone specializing in regulatory defense. Already done, Adrian replied, then seemed to realize he'd revealed more than intended. Precautionary measures. The kind of protection any successful business needs in today's environment. So he'd definitely retained Blackstone and Associates, and he was already attributing his problems to competitive pressure rather than criminal investigation. That suggested he either didn't understand the scope of what we'd uncovered or was hoping to convince me and through me, potentially others, that he was being unfairly targeted. I'm sure you'll resolve whatever challenges you're facing, I said reassuringly. You always were resourceful about finding solutions to complex problems. Adrian's smile returned, warmer and more confident. We should have dinner soon. I know things between us became complicated, but we had good times too. Remember that weekend in Napa when we first talked about the house? The reference to the prenup signing was deliberate, a reminder of his victory and a subtle suggestion that he still held advantages I couldn't challenge. But it also revealed how little he understood about my current position. I do remember, I replied. That beautiful vineyard, the sunset dinner, all those romantic discussions about trust and partnership. Exactly, Adrian said, moving closer. We were good together, Celia. Maybe we could be again. For a moment, I allowed myself to feel the full impact of his charisma, the way he could make the most calculated manipulation feel like genuine emotion, the skill with which he identified exactly what someone wanted to hear and delivered it with perfect timing. It was a masterful performance, and if I hadn't spent the past month documenting his systematic fraud, I might have been tempted to believe it. Adrian, I said, placing my hand on his chest, are you asking me to get back together? I'm asking you to remember what we had before everything became so complicated, he replied. Before lawyers and financial pressures and all the external forces that drove us apart. It was breathtaking in its audacity, reframing his theft and betrayal as external forces while positioning himself as someone who'd been hurt by circumstances beyond his control. But it also revealed something crucial. He was scared enough to attempt reconciliation with the woman he'd systematically defrauded. That's a beautiful thought, I said, letting my voice carry just enough emotion to sound convincing. But I think we both need time to sort through our individual challenges before we could consider rebuilding anything together. Adrian's expression shifted slightly, disappointment mixing with calculation. Of course, I understand. But Celia, if you ever need anything, if anyone tries to create problems for you or your business, I want you to know you can call me. The offer was simultaneously generous and threatening, designed to sound supportive while implying that he had the power to protect or harm my interests. It was exactly the kind of sophisticated manipulation that had made him so effective during our marriage. That's very kind, I replied, though I hope we both stay focused on positive solutions rather than dwelling on potential problems. Absolutely, Adrian agreed. Though sometimes problems find us whether we're looking for them or not. My phone buzzed with a text that I glanced at discreetly. Urgent, multiple account freezes discovered. Meeting tomorrow am. It was from someone using Adrian's attorney's office number. I should probably get back to Marcus, I said, stepping away slightly. But it was lovely talking with you, Adrian. Take care of yourself. You too, he replied, his eyes studying my face as if trying to decode something he couldn't quite identify. And Celia, be careful. Seattle can be a complicated city for successful people who attract the wrong kind of attention. I walked away from that conversation with a clear understanding of Adrian's state of mind. He suspected he was under investigation, but didn't know the scope or source. He was trying to neutralize potential threats through a combination of charm, implicit warnings, and attempts to rebuild alliances with people who might have influence over his situation. Most importantly, he still believed he was dealing with external enemies rather than understanding that his former wife had systematically infiltrated and taken control of the financial institutions that held his future. As I rejoined Marcus, near the museum's exit, I felt the familiar thrill of holding decisive advantages in a complex strategic situation. Adrian was playing defense against threats he couldn't identify, while I controlled the investigation that was systematically dismantling his empire. How was the ex-husband conversation? Marcus asked as we waited for the valet to retrieve his car. Educational, I replied. He's exactly who I thought he was, which is both disappointing and oddly reassuring. Ready to move on completely? I thought about Mrs. Vasquez's house, Owen's frozen accounts, Grace's displaced homeowners, and Renata's investigation into municipal corruption. Adrian's scheme had victimized dozens of people who deserved justice, and his attempt to manipulate me tonight had only reinforced my determination to see it through to completion. More than ready, I said. Some bridges need to be burned completely before you can build something better. Tomorrow, Adrian would discover that his account freezes weren't isolated regulatory harassment but part of a comprehensive investigation that would expose his entire network. And he'd realize that the woman he'd tried to charm tonight was the architect of his downfall. But tonight, I was content to let him believe he still had time to escape the consequences of his choices. The emergency board meeting at Northwest Maritime Holdings convened at a.m. on a gray Thursday morning, called after Owen's overnight audit had uncovered what he carefully termed systematic irregularities requiring immediate board action. I arrived at the conference room 15 minutes early, using the time to review the comprehensive report that would effectively detonate Adrian's financial empire. Owen's documentation was meticulous and damning. Over the past 18 months, Cascade Private Banking had approved $347 million in loans to borrowers who had provided falsified documentation, manipulated asset valuations, or created shell company structures designed to obscure beneficial ownership. The fraud wasn't isolated to a few problematic accounts, it represented nearly 15% of the bank's entire portfolio. Ladies and gentlemen, I began as the board members settled into their seats. What we're about to discuss represents the most serious compliance crisis in Northwest Maritime's history. Mr. Blake's investigation has uncovered evidence of systematic fraud that exposes our institution to criminal liability, regulatory sanctions, and civil litigation that could destroy shareholder value. Robert Ashford looked as if he'd aged 5 years since our last meeting. How serious? Serious enough that I've already contacted federal banking regulators and recommended immediate asset freezes for all accounts showing evidence of fraudulent documentation, I replied. As of this morning, we've frozen $127 million in outstanding loan balances pending federal investigation. The room erupted in concerned murmurs. Margaret Thornfield leaned forward, her expression grim. Are you saying we've been unknowingly facilitating criminal activity? I'm saying we've been systematically defrauded by a coordinated network of borrowers who use forged documents, shell companies, and bribery to obtain loans they weren't qualified to receive, I said, advancing to a slide showing the network diagram Owen had prepared. The coordination appears to center around a consulting firm called Pacific Northwest Development Services, which has facilitated fraudulent transactions across multiple borrower accounts. James Morrison studied the presentation with growing alarm. What's our potential liability exposure? Conservatively, $200 million in direct losses from loans that will likely default once the fraud is exposed, I replied. Additionally, we face potential criminal charges for money laundering, regulatory fines that could reach $500 million, and civil lawsuits from the communities damaged by the fraudulent development projects. Criminal charges? Ashford's voice was barely above a whisper. Federal prosecutors take banking fraud seriously, especially when it involves systematic corruption of municipal approval processes, I explained. Board members who were aware of irregularities and failed to act face potential personal criminal liability. The legal implications weren't lost on anyone in the room. These were successful executives who'd spent their careers avoiding exactly this kind of exposure, and the possibility of criminal prosecution was their worst nightmare. What are you recommending? Thornfield asked. Complete cooperation with federal investigators, I said. Immediate termination of all relationships with entities connected to the fraud network, and systematic review of our entire portfolio to identify any additional compromised accounts. How quickly can we implement these measures? They're already being implemented, I replied. As board chair of the Oversight Committee, I authorized emergency action to protect the institution's interests and ensure compliance with federal banking regulations. David Kellner raised his hand tentatively. Are there specific borrowers we should be concerned about? High-profile accounts that might generate media attention? Several, I said, clicking to a slide that showed account details without revealing names, including a prominent local architect whose firm appears to be central to the coordination of fraudulent activities. This account alone represents $12 million in potentially fraudulent loans. I could see board members exchanging glances clearly, trying to identify which architect in Seattle might have $12 million in outstanding loans. Adrian's public profile made him an obvious candidate, though I doubted any of them would make the connection until media coverage began. The architect in question, I continued, used forged power of attorney documents to access accounts belonging to his ex-wife, manipulated income statements to qualify for loans beyond his actual capacity, and coordinated with corrupt city officials to obtain advance information about zoning changes. Jesus, Morrison muttered. How did our compliance procedures miss something this extensive? Because the fraud was sophisticated and coordinated, I replied. The perpetrators understood our verification processes and designed their schemes to exploit specific vulnerabilities. This wasn't opportunistic fraud, it was systematic criminal enterprise. The board voted unanimously to authorize full cooperation with federal investigators, terminate all relationships with compromised accounts, and implement enhanced verification procedures for future lending decisions. More importantly, for my purposes, they granted the Oversight Committee unlimited authority to direct the investigation and coordinate with law enforcement agencies. As the meeting concluded, Ashford approached me privately. Miss Chen, I want you to know that the board appreciates your diligence in uncovering these problems. If you hadn't pushed for the compliance review, we might not have discovered the fraud until it was too late to minimize damage. Protecting shareholder interests is my primary responsibility, I replied, though I suspect we'll discover this situation is more complex than we initially realized. After leaving Northwest Maritime's offices, I drove directly to Grace's Advocacy Center, where she was coordinating legal representation for the homeowners who'd been victimized by Adrian's property theft scheme. The contrast between the sterile corporate environment I'd just left and the community-focused energy of Grace's organization was striking. Federal prosecutors are taking the case, Grace told me as we reviewed documentation for Mrs. Vasquez's property recovery lawsuit. Apparently someone provided them with comprehensive evidence of systematic fraud affecting dozens of elderly homeowners throughout the city. Someone? Grace smiled knowingly. Someone with access to banking records, municipal filing systems, and forensic analysis capabilities that exceed what my organization could afford. This mysterious someone has been very helpful. Mrs. Vasquez was sitting at a conference table with 3 other elderly homeowners, all of whom had received legal notices claiming their properties had been sold without their knowledge or consent. Through Grace's translation, I learned that each of them had been contacted by representatives of Pacific Northwest Development Services offering to help them maximize the value of their properties through strategic sales timing. They were so polite, Mrs. Vasquez said through Grace. Professional men in expensive suits who said they could help me retire comfortably if I trusted them to handle the paperwork. I told them I didn't want to sell, but they said they would take care of everything. The sophistication of the scheme was chilling. Adrian's network hadn't simply forged documents, they'd psychologically manipulated elderly homeowners into believing they were receiving professional assistance while actually being systematically defrauded. What happens to their properties now? I asked Grace. Federal court will freeze all assets pending investigation, Grace replied. The properties can't be sold or demolished until the fraud cases are resolved. Mrs. Vasquez and the others will likely get their homes back, plus significant compensation for the trauma they've experienced. My phone buzzed with a call from Renata Vale. I need to see you immediately, she said, without preamble. Adrian just held a press conference claiming he's being targeted by a vindictive ex-spouse who's using false accusations to destroy his career. When? 20 minutes ago. Channel 7 News. Live television, full damage control mode. He's positioned himself as the victim of a sophisticated revenge scheme orchestrated by someone with unlimited financial resources and regulatory connections. The timing was interesting. Adrian had discovered the account freezes and immediately launched a preemptive media campaign designed to discredit any future accusations by framing them as personal vendetta rather than legitimate criminal investigation. What specifically did he say? That he's discovered evidence of a coordinated effort to manipulate banking regulations and federal investigators to target him personally, Renata replied. He claimed that certain individuals have used shell companies and regulatory capture to weaponize compliance procedures against successful professionals who've achieved prominence in their fields. It was a masterful strategy to take the actual facts of his situation and flip them to portray himself as the victim of exactly the kind of scheme he'd actually been running. By accusing me of regulatory manipulation before the criminal charges were announced, he was trying to undermine the credibility of the eventual prosecutions. Did he name me specifically? Not directly, but he made repeated references to tech entrepreneurs with regulatory connections and individuals who use financial resources to circumvent normal legal processes. Anyone who knows about your divorce would understand the implications. I spent the rest of the afternoon coordinating with Owen and federal investigators, ensuring that Adrian's media campaign wouldn't undermine the criminal cases we were building. The evidence was so comprehensive that no amount of public relations could explain away the forged documents, shell company structures, and systematic fraud we documented. But Adrian's press conference had served one purpose. It confirmed that he now understood he was facing serious criminal exposure and was prepared to fight back aggressively. The charming, manipulative architect who'd tried to seduce me at the art gallery had been replaced by someone desperate enough to risk everything on a public relations gambit. That evening, I met Savannah for dinner at a quiet restaurant in Capitol Hill, both of us needing to decompress after the intensity of the day's revelations. "He's scared," Savannah observed, reviewing news coverage of Adrian's press conference on her phone. "This isn't strategic positioning, this is panic." "Good," I replied. "Scared people make mistakes. They also lash out unpredictably," Savannah warned. "If Adrian realizes you're behind the investigation, he might try something desperate." "Like what?" "Like claiming you manipulated your divorce proceedings to gain control of banking institutions specifically to target him," Savannah said. "It's completely false, but false accusations can still damage reputations if they're promoted aggressively." Enough. I considered the implications. Adrian's media strategy was designed to muddy the waters sufficiently that criminal charges might be perceived as continuation of a personal dispute rather than legitimate law enforcement action. It was psychologically sophisticated and potentially effective if he could maintain the narrative long enough to create reasonable doubt. "There's something else," Savannah continued. "I've been monitoring financial transfers from accounts connected to Pacific Northwest Development Services. In the past 24 hours, someone has been systematically moving money to offshore accounts in jurisdictions that don't have extradition treaties with the United States." "Adrian?" "Either Adrian or someone else in his network who realizes the investigation is accelerating," Savannah replied. "The transfers total approximately $18 million so far, which suggests they're liquidating emergency reserves." The offshore transfers were significant for two reasons. They indicated that Adrian's network was preparing for potential criminal charges, and they provided additional evidence of consciousness of guilt that prosecutors could use to demonstrate criminal intent. "Can we track where the money is going?" "Some of it," Savannah said, "but sophisticated money laundering operations use multiple jurisdictions and shell companies to obscure the ultimate beneficiaries. We'll probably never recover most of it." As we finished dinner, my phone rang with a call from Grace. "Turn on Channel 7 News," she said urgently. "Adrian's holding another press conference, and this time he's not being subtle about his accusations." We found a television in the restaurant's bar area, where Adrian was addressing a small group of reporters outside Blackstone and Associates' offices. He looked composed but determined, projecting the image of someone fighting courageously against overwhelming odds. "Recent developments have confirmed my suspicions about the coordinated effort to destroy my career and reputation," Adrian was saying. "Federal investigators have been provided with fabricated evidence designed to support false accusations of criminal activity. What we're witnessing is the weaponization of regulatory agencies by individuals who lack the integrity to compete fairly in legitimate business environments." It was a direct challenge not just to the investigation, but to my credibility and character. Adrian was gambling that he could frame the criminal charges as continuation of our divorce dispute, thereby undermining their legitimacy before they were even filed. "Mr. Royce," a reporter called out, "are you suggesting that federal banking investigators have been misled by false information?" "I'm suggesting that certain individuals have used their financial resources and regulatory connections to manipulate legitimate compliance procedures," Adrian replied. "When someone controls banking institutions through shell companies and uses that control to freeze accounts belonging to their personal enemies, it represents a fundamental corruption of our financial system." The accusation was breathtaking in its audacity. Adrian was claiming that I had corrupted federal banking regulation to pursue personal revenge, an allegation that, if believed, could undermine years of legitimate investigation and prosecution. but it also represented a critical miscalculation. By making specific accusations about shell company control and regulatory manipulation, Adrian had provided prosecutors with additional evidence of his own criminal behavior. His press conference wasn't just desperate public relations, it was confession disguised as accusation. "This should be interesting," Savannah murmured as we watched Adrian field questions from reporters. "He's just given federal prosecutors everything they need to demonstrate consciousness of guilt and obstruction of justice." I smiled grimly, watching my ex-husband destroy himself on live television while trying to destroy me. Adrian always was his own worst enemy. He just needed the right circumstances to prove it. The Seattle Business Journal's headline appeared online at 6:43 a.m. Friday morning. "Tech entrepreneur used shell companies to manipulate banking regulations in revenge scheme against ex-husband." Below it was a carefully constructed article that painted me as a vindictive billionaire who had corrupted federal institutions to pursue personal vendettas against former spouses. I read the article twice over coffee in my temporary apartment, analyzing each paragraph for accuracy and strategic implication. Adrian's counterattack was more sophisticated than I'd expected. Instead of simply denying the fraud allegations, he'd provided journalists with a detailed alternative narrative that reframed my legitimate investigation as corporate abuse of regulatory power. The article quoted unnamed sources at Cascade Private Banking claiming that a mysterious investor had acquired controlling interest in Northwest Maritime Holdings specifically to target Adrian's accounts. It described my shell company structure as evidence of deception rather than standard corporate practice. Most damaging, it included what appeared to be recordings of conversations I'd never had, discussing strategies for weaponizing compliance procedures against political enemies. My phone rang immediately. "Have you seen the Journal article?" Savannah asked without preamble. "I'm reading it now," I replied. "The recordings are fabricated, sophisticated audio manipulation, but completely false." "Can you prove that?" "Eventually. Digital forensic analysis will show the audio files have been artificially constructed. But by the time we establish that, the damage to my credibility will already be done." Savannah was quiet for a moment. "This is more than desperate public relations, Celia. This is systematic character assassination designed to destroy your professional reputation, regardless of what happens with the criminal charges." She was right. Adrian wasn't just trying to escape prosecution, he was trying to ensure that even if he went to prison, my career and reputation would be destroyed in the process. It was elegant revenge disguised as legal defense. "There's more," Savannah continued. "Channel 4 is running a follow-up story this evening featuring interviews with former employees of your company who claim you've used regulatory connections to intimidate competitors in the past." "Former employees?" "3 people I don't recognize, all claiming they witnessed you coordinating with federal agencies to target business rivals." The interviews look professionally produced, not spontaneous news coverage. I pulled up my laptop and began researching the names Savannah provided. None of the supposed former employees had actually worked for my company, though they'd all been crafted with plausible backgrounds that would be difficult to disprove quickly. Adrian had assembled an entire cast of false witnesses to support his alternative narrative. He's not just fighting the fraud charges, I realized. He's trying to completely destroy my credibility before the federal prosecutors announce their case. "More than that," Savannah said. "If he can convince people you've corrupted federal banking regulation, it undermines every aspect of the investigation. Prosecutors won't want to move forward with cases that might be perceived as tainted by personal vendettas." The strategic brilliance was undeniable. Adrian was using the same media manipulation skills that had made him successful during our divorce, but amplified and coordinated with professional crisis management resources. If his narrative gained traction, it could derail years of careful investigation and allow him to escape consequences for systematic fraud. I spent the morning coordinating with Owen and federal investigators, providing documentation that proved the audio recordings were fabricated and establishing timelines that contradicted the false witness statements. But defending against sophisticated disinformation required resources and time we might not have. "The fabricated audio is particularly concerning," Owen told me during a secure call. "It demonstrates access to advanced technology and significant financial resources. This isn't amateur character assassination, it's professional-grade disinformation." Can federal prosecutors still move forward? They're reviewing their options, Owen replied carefully. But if the media narrative gains enough traction, it could compromise jury selection and make convictions more difficult to obtain. By noon, the story had been picked up by national business media, with CNN running a segment titled "When Tech Money Corrupts Banking Regulation." The coverage was devastating to my reputation, portraying me as exactly the kind of wealthy individual who used financial influence to circumvent legal processes for personal gain. My company's stock price dropped 12% in morning trading. 3 major clients called to express concerns about ongoing business relationships. The board of directors of a nonprofit organization where I served requested my immediate resignation to avoid controversy. Adrian had successfully weaponized the same regulatory system I'd used against him, turning my legitimate investigation into evidence of my own corruption. It was masterful in its psychological sophistication and potentially catastrophic in its effectiveness. I was reviewing crisis management options when Grace called with urgent news. "Eleanor Shue wants to see you immediately," she said. "She's been following the media coverage and has some thoughts about Adrian's strategy." Judge Eleanor Shue had been my mother's closest friend and had served as an unofficial mentor throughout my legal career. If anyone could provide guidance about navigating the intersection of legal proceedings and media manipulation, it would be Eleanor. I met Eleanor at her private chambers in the King County Courthouse, a space that reflected 4 decades of judicial service with understated elegance. Eleanor herself appeared every inch the distinguished jurist, silver hair perfectly styled, intelligent eyes that missed nothing, and presence that commanded immediate respect. "Adrian Royce is more dangerous than you realized," Eleanor said without preamble as I took the seat across from her desk. "This isn't just criminal defense, it's systematic destruction designed to ensure mutual assured destruction regardless of legal outcomes." Meaning he's calculated that if he's going to prison, he wants to ensure you're completely destroyed in the process, Eleanor replied. "The fabricated evidence, the false witnesses, the coordinated media campaign, all of it is designed to make your downfall so spectacular that his own criminal prosecution becomes secondary to the story of your alleged corruption." Eleanor pulled out a folder containing what appeared to be additional media coverage I hadn't seen. 3 major news outlets are preparing investigative pieces about your business practices. A Senate subcommittee is considering hearings about tech industry influence over banking regulation. The SEC has received complaints about your shell company structures that will trigger formal investigations. The scope of Adrian's counterattack was staggering. He'd essentially declared war on my entire professional existence, using resources and connections I hadn't known he possessed. "How is he coordinating all of this?" "Maxim Calderon," Eleanor said simply. "The developer who's been funding Adrian's consulting network has extensive political connections and unlimited resources for crisis management. This isn't just Adrian's revenge, it's a coordinated effort by everyone who could be exposed by your investigation." The revelation reframed everything. I hadn't just been fighting Adrian's individual fraud, I'd been challenging an entire network of corrupt developers, politicians, and financial institutions who had billions of dollars at stake. "What do you recommend?" Eleanor leaned back in her chair, studying my face with the kind of careful assessment I remembered from childhood visits to her home. "You have 2 options. Retreat, completely accept that your reputation will be destroyed but that you'll avoid criminal exposure yourself. Or escalate the conflict by providing evidence that definitively proves your innocence while simultaneously exposing the scope of their corruption." "What would escalation look like?" "Public disclosure of everything you've discovered," Eleanor replied. "Financial records showing the systematic fraud, documentation of municipal corruption, evidence that Adrian's network has been systematically stealing from elderly homeowners and manipulating city planning processes. That would destroy any chance of successful prosecutions." "It would ensure successful prosecutions," Eleanor corrected. "The evidence is so overwhelming that public exposure would make it impossible for prosecutors to avoid action. Adrian's strategy only works if he can control the narrative. If you provide irrefutable evidence of systematic corruption, his character assassination becomes irrelevant." Eleanor was proposing that I abandon careful coordination with federal investigators in favor of immediate public disclosure designed to overwhelm Adrian's disinformation campaign. It was risky, but potentially more effective than allowing him to control media coverage while prosecutors worked behind the scenes. There's something else you should know, Eleanor continued. Renata Vale has been threatened. Threatened? How? Anonymous calls warning her that pursuing stories about certain development projects could result in personal and professional consequences, Eleanor said. Someone has also been spreading rumors about her previous reporting errors, trying to undermine her credibility before she can publish anything about Adrian's network. The threats against Renata confirmed that Adrian's counterattack wasn't just targeting me, it was designed to neutralize anyone who could expose his corruption. He was systematically eliminating potential sources of damaging coverage while promoting his own alternative narrative. Judge Shu, I said carefully, are you advising me to coordinate with Renata on comprehensive public disclosure? I'm advising you to remember that justice delayed is often justice denied, Eleanor replied. Adrian's strategy depends on prolonging the uncertainty while his character assassination gains momentum. The best defense against sophisticated disinformation is overwhelming truth. I left Eleanor's chambers with a clear understanding of my strategic options. I could continue working quietly with federal investigators while Adrian destroyed my reputation, or I could immediately disclose everything we'd discovered and force a public reckoning that would end the uncertainty but potentially compromise ongoing prosecutions. That evening, I met Renata at a secure location. Savannah had arranged a private dining room in a hotel where we could speak without concern about surveillance or unwanted attention. Renata looked tired but determined, clearly feeling the pressure of the threats she'd received while remaining committed to exposing the truth. They're trying to destroy both of us, Renata said without preamble. You through fabricated evidence, me through professional intimidation. But I have everything I need to publish the complete story: financial records, municipal corruption, documentation, evidence of systematic fraud affecting dozens of victims. How quickly can you publish? 72 hours if I work around the clock, Renata replied. But once I publish, there's no controlling how the story develops. It becomes national news, federal prosecutors are forced to act immediately, and everyone involved becomes a public figure, including Adrian's victims. Including everyone, Renata confirmed. Mrs. Vasquez, the other elderly homeowners, city officials who took bribes, developers who manipulated zoning processes, all of it becomes public record. I considered the implications. Public disclosure would end Adrian's character assassination campaign by providing irrefutable evidence of his criminal behavior. But it would also expose vulnerable victims to media scrutiny and potentially compromise carefully planned prosecutions. There's one more consideration, Renata added. If we wait much longer, Adrian's disinformation campaign might become so effective that people won't believe the truth when it's finally revealed. Sometimes the first narrative people hear becomes the one they accept regardless of subsequent evidence. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The recordings are just the beginning. Withdraw your complaint or face complete destruction. You have 24 hours to decide. I showed the message to Renata, who photographed it immediately. That's evidence of obstruction of justice and witness intimidation, she said. It also suggests they have additional fabricated evidence ready to release. What do you think we should do? Renata smiled grimly. I think we should remind Adrian Royce that investigative journalists don't respond well to threats. Give me permission to publish everything, and by Monday morning the entire world will know exactly who he really is. I thought about Mrs. Vasquez's dignified determination to fight for her home, Grace's commitment to protecting vulnerable communities, Owen's integrity in exposing banking fraud despite personal risk, and Eleanor's reminder that justice delayed is often justice denied. Publish it all, I said. Let's end this. Renata's expose went live on the Seattle Post-Intelligencer website at exactly a.m. Monday morning, accompanied by a coordinated release of supporting documents that crashed the newspaper's servers within the first hour. The headline was devastating in its simplicity: The Corruption Network, How Seattle's Development Elite Stole Millions Through Systematic Fraud. I watched the story break from Savannah's office, where we'd assembled a war room of laptops and monitors to track media coverage, social media response, and the inevitable attempts at damage control that would follow. The article was everything Renata had promised: comprehensive, meticulously documented, and impossible to dismiss as partisan attack journalism. The piece opened with Mrs. Vasquez's story, told through her own words translated into English, describing how professional men in expensive suits had convinced her to trust them with paperwork that would help her retire comfortably. From there, Renata methodically revealed the entire network, Pacific Northwest Development Services as the coordination hub, Adrian's architectural firm as the technical facilitator, Maxim Calderon's development empire as the ultimate beneficiary, and a web of corrupt city officials who had sold zoning approvals for cash payments disguised as consulting fees. The financial documentation is bulletproof, Savannah said, scrolling through reader comments that were pouring in faster than the website could display them. Bank records, shell company and corporation documents, digital forensic analysis of forged signatures. Everything Owen provided is presented with the kind of detail that makes denial impossible. But what made the story truly devastating wasn't just the evidence of fraud, it was the human impact. Renata had interviewed 12 elderly homeowners who'd been victimized, 3 community activists whose opposition to developments had been systematically ignored, and 2 former city employees who'd been forced out after refusing to participate in the corruption scheme. Seattle's development boom has created tremendous wealth for some while displacing longtime residents and destroying historic neighborhoods, Renata had written. What this investigation reveals is that much of this transformation wasn't the result of market forces or legitimate business competition. It was the product of systematic criminal enterprise designed to steal property from vulnerable residents and corrupt municipal processes for private gain. My phone started ringing at 6:15 a.m. and didn't stop. CNN wanted a statement about my role in exposing the fraud. The FBI requested an immediate meeting to coordinate their investigation with the newly public evidence. Seattle's mayor announced a press conference to address the municipal corruption allegations. 3 different congressional offices called to discuss potential federal hearings. At 7:30 a.m., Adrian held an emergency press conference outside Blackstone and Associates offices, flanked by his crisis management team and looking like someone who'd discovered his carefully constructed world was collapsing in real time. The confident, manipulative architect had been replaced by someone who appeared genuinely rattled by the scope of what had been revealed. The allegations published this morning represent a coordinated attack on successful professionals by individuals who have corrupted legitimate investigative journalism for personal vendettas, Adrian began, his voice lacking the smooth confidence he'd displayed during previous media appearances. What you're seeing is the weaponization of regulatory agencies and media institutions by people who lack the integrity to compete fairly in legitimate business environments. But the response felt hollow now that Renata had provided comprehensive documentation of his criminal activities. Adrian's claims about personal vendettas and regulatory manipulation appeared desperate when contrasted with bank records showing systematic fraud, recorded conversations revealing bribery schemes, and testimony from dozens of victims whose lives had been damaged by his network's activities. Mr. Royce, a reporter called out, how do you respond to the digital forensic evidence showing that you used forged power of attorney documents to access your ex-wife's financial accounts? All financial transactions were conducted in accordance with legal documentation prepared by qualified attorneys, Adrian replied, but his composure was clearly strained. The suggestion that legitimate business activities constitute criminal behavior represents a fundamental misunderstanding of how complex financial structures operate. What about the recordings of you discussing bribes paid to city officials? Those recordings have been taken out of context and edited to misrepresent routine business conversations, Adrian said, though his answer lacked conviction. Professional consultation with municipal officials is a standard practice in the development industry. I watched Adrian's press conference with a mixture of satisfaction and something approaching pity. The charming, manipulative man who'd convinced me to trust him completely was being forced to confront the consequences of his systematic betrayal of that trust. But he was also someone who'd built his entire identity around avoiding responsibility for his actions, and watching him attempt to deflect blame even in the face of overwhelming evidence was both predictable and pathetic. At I held my own press conference in the lobby of my company's downtown offices, surrounded by the kind of corporate environment that projected stability and success rather than desperate damage control. Unlike Adrian's defensive positioning, I was able to present myself as someone who'd discovered criminal activity and had cooperated fully with authorities to ensure justice for the victims. When I learned that my ex-husband had used forged documents to steal from me during our divorce, I initially considered it a personal matter. I began, reading from prepared remarks that had been carefully crafted to present my investigation as civic duty rather than personal revenge. But as the scope of his criminal network became clear, I realized that many other people had been victimized by the same systematic fraud that had been used against me. Miss Tran asked a reporter from the Seattle Times, "Why did you choose to work with federal investigators rather than simply pursuing civil litigation?" "Because this wasn't just about recovering my personal losses," I replied. "When elderly homeowners like Mrs. Vasquez are being systematically defrauded through forged documents and municipal corruption, it becomes a matter of protecting vulnerable communities rather than settling personal disputes." "Are you concerned about Mr. Royce's allegations that you manipulated banking regulations for personal revenge?" "Mr. Royce's allegations have been thoroughly investigated by federal authorities and found to be completely false," I said. "The audio recordings he provided as evidence have been proven through digital forensic analysis to be artificially constructed. The witnesses he produced to support his claims have been shown to have no connection to my company or business activities." The contrast between my press conference and Adrian's was immediately apparent to anyone following the story. I had comprehensive documentation, federal investigative support, and a narrative that positioned me as someone seeking justice for fraud victims. Adrian had increasingly desperate denials, fabricated evidence that had been exposed as false, and a strategy that depended on people believing conspiracy theories rather than documented evidence. By noon, the financial consequences for Adrian's network were beginning to cascade. Cascade Private Banking announced the immediate termination of all relationships with borrowers connected to the fraud scheme. Northwest Maritime Holdings called an emergency board meeting to address criminal liability exposure. The City of Seattle suspended all pending development approvals pending investigation of the bribery allegations. Most significantly, federal prosecutors announced that they were accelerating their timeline for filing criminal charges based on the comprehensive evidence that had been publicly disclosed. The investigation that might have taken months to develop through traditional law enforcement procedures was being fast-tracked because Renata's article had provided everything prosecutors needed to seek immediate indictments. "The evidence of systematic fraud, municipal corruption, and identity theft is overwhelming," announced U.S. Attorney Sarah Martinez during an afternoon press conference. "We will be seeking criminal charges against multiple defendants in what appears to be one of the most extensive development fraud schemes in Seattle's history." Adrian's attempt to destroy my credibility had backfired spectacularly. Instead of undermining the investigation, his character assassination campaign had prompted accelerated disclosure that made denial impossible and prosecution inevitable. At p.m., I convened an emergency board meeting at Northwest Maritime Holdings in my capacity as chair of the Oversight Committee. The conference room that had once been dominated by Adrian's allies was now filled with board members who understood they were managing a criminal enterprise that could destroy their careers and reputations. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, "we have received notification that federal prosecutors will be seeking criminal charges against Northwest Maritime Holdings for facilitating money laundering and bank fraud. As the Oversight Committee chair, I'm recommending immediate measures to protect the institution and demonstrate cooperation with federal authorities." "What sort of measures?" asked Robert Ashford, who looked like he'd aged a decade since the morning's revelations. "Complete divestiture of all assets connected to the fraud scheme," I replied. "Immediate termination of all personnel who participated in or facilitated criminal activities, and systematic review of our entire portfolio to identify any additional compromised investments." Margaret Thornfield leaned forward. "Are you proposing that we essentially liquidate the company?" "I'm proposing that we salvage what can be legitimately preserved while accepting responsibility for the criminal activities that occurred under our oversight," I said. "The alternative is defending an indefensible position that will result in complete destruction through criminal prosecution and civil litigation." The board voted unanimously to implement my recommendations, effectively placing me in control of dismantling the financial empire that had enabled Adrian's fraud network. It was elegant justice. The same institutions he'd corrupted were now being used to systematically eliminate his access to the resources that had made his crimes possible. As the meeting concluded, Owen approached me with news that provided the final piece of satisfaction I'd been seeking throughout this entire process. "Federal agents arrested Adrian an hour ago," he said quietly. Along with Maxim Calderon and 7 city officials connected to the bribery scheme, the charges include fraud, money laundering, racketeering, and conspiracy to commit federal crimes. I felt something I hadn't experienced since the day Adrian had walked away with our house. Complete vindication. Not just personal satisfaction, but the knowledge that justice was being served for everyone who'd been victimized by his systematic betrayal of trust. There's something else, Owen continued. The federal court has issued orders freezing all assets connected to the fraud scheme and authorizing full restitution to victims. Mrs. Vasquez and the other elderly homeowners will get their properties back, plus compensation for the trauma they experienced. As I drove home that evening, I realized that the woman who'd sat in the courthouse 6 months ago watching Adrian claim ownership of our house no longer existed. She'd been replaced by someone who understood that real power wasn't about accumulating wealth or seeking personal revenge. It was about using whatever resources and capabilities you possessed to ensure that people who abused others faced appropriate consequences. Adrian had taught me that trust could be weaponized, that intimacy could be manipulated, and that charming presentation could disguise systematic cruelty. But in teaching me those lessons, he'd also given me the knowledge and motivation to ensure he could never use those techniques to harm anyone else. The house he'd taken had been just a piece of property. What I'd gained in the process of reclaiming it was something far more valuable: the understanding that justice, when pursued with sufficient intelligence and resources, could be both comprehensive and deeply satisfying. 6 months after Adrian's arrest, I stood in the living room of the Belltown waterfront house he'd claimed in our divorce, sunlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked Elliott Bay. The federal court had returned the property to me as part of the comprehensive restitution order, along with significant additional compensation for the systematic theft Adrian had committed throughout our marriage. But as I walked through rooms I'd once thought of as home, I realized that reclaiming the physical space wasn't what I'd actually been seeking. During the long months of investigation and legal maneuvering, the house felt like a museum exhibit of someone else's life, beautiful, expensive, and completely disconnected from who I'd become. "It's exactly as you left it," Grace said, joining me by the windows where we could see the Seattle skyline stretching toward the mountains. "Adrian apparently didn't change anything after the divorce. Even your books are still on the shelves." She was right. Despite having legal ownership for 6 months, Adrian had preserved the house exactly as it had been during our marriage, as if he'd been waiting for me to return and resume our life together. The realization was unsettling, not because I missed our relationship, but because it revealed how little he'd understood about what he'd actually destroyed. "He never really wanted the house," I said, understanding finally dawning. "He wanted control over me. The house was just leverage." Grace nodded, studying my expression carefully. "And now that you have it back?" I considered the question, while reviewing everything that had changed since that afternoon in the courthouse when Judge Morrison had awarded Adrian sole ownership. My company had expanded internationally, driven partly by the credibility boost that came from exposing systematic fraud and cooperating fully with federal authorities. The tech industry had embraced me as someone who'd used financial expertise to protect vulnerable communities rather than simply accumulating personal wealth. More importantly, I'd discovered capabilities I hadn't known I possessed: the ability to build coalitions, to coordinate complex investigations, to use institutional power for purposes beyond personal enrichment. The woman who'd married Adrian because she'd thought she needed stability had been replaced by someone who understood that real security came from the knowledge that you could protect yourself and others from those who abused trust and exploited vulnerability. "I'm going to donate it," I said, the decision crystallizing as I spoke, "to the foundation Grace and I are establishing for women recovering from financial abuse." Grace's eyes widened. "Celia, this house is worth over $4 million. Are you sure?" "I'm sure," I replied, feeling lighter than I had in months. "The foundation needs a headquarters, somewhere visible that demonstrates our commitment to helping women rebuild their lives after systematic financial betrayal. This house represents everything we're fighting against: the use of legal and financial systems to control and manipulate intimate partners." We spent the afternoon walking through each room, discussing how the space could be transformed from Adrian's monument to manipulation into something that would actually help people. The master bedroom would become offices for counselors specializing in financial abuse recovery. The study where Adrian had planned his fraud schemes would house legal advocates who could help women navigate complex property disputes. The living room where he'd charmed potential victims would become a meeting space for support groups and educational workshops. "You know he's been trying to contact you," Grace said as we reviewed architectural plans for the conversion. "Letters from federal prison, requests for visits, even attempts to reach you through Savannah's office." "What does he want?" "Forgiveness, apparently. According to his latest letter, he's discovered through prison counseling that his behavior was the result of childhood trauma and addiction issues he never properly addressed. He wants to make amends as part of his recovery process." The psychological manipulation was so perfectly Adrian that I found myself laughing. Even from federal prison, facing 25 years for racketeering and fraud, he was still trying to reframe his systematic criminal behavior as something that had happened to him rather than choices he'd made. The request for forgiveness was probably sincere from his perspective. He genuinely believed that expressing regret should be sufficient to repair the damage he'd caused. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing," Grace replied, "but I think he deserves a response. Not forgiveness necessarily, but acknowledgement that you've moved beyond what he did to you." That evening, I had dinner with the core team that had helped expose Adrian's network. Savannah, Owen, Renata, and Eleanor at a quiet restaurant overlooking Lake Union. It had become our monthly tradition, a way to maintain the relationships that had developed during the investigation while celebrating the ongoing impact of our work. "Mrs. Vasquez got the keys to her house back yesterday," Owen reported, showing us photos from the ceremony where federal authorities had officially returned properties to the elderly homeowners who'd been defrauded. "She wanted me to tell you that she's planning to invite you for dinner once she's finished redecorating." Redecorating? Apparently she's been planning improvements for months, waiting until she was certain the house was really hers again, Owen explained. "New kitchen, updated bathroom, garden expansion." She's treating the recovery as an opportunity to make the place even more her own. Mrs. Vasquez's approach to reclaiming her home provided a model I found inspiring. Instead of simply returning to the status quo, she was using the recovery process to create something better than what she'd had before. It was exactly the kind of transformative thinking I wanted to encourage through the foundation. "Speaking of impact," Renata said, pulling out her tablet to show us recent coverage. "The congressional hearings on banking regulation reform start next week. 3 senators have specifically cited our investigation as evidence that private banking oversight needs to be strengthened." The federal legislation that had emerged from our investigation, nicknamed the Vasquez Act after Mrs. Vasquez's case, would require enhanced verification procedures for all private banking transactions and create criminal penalties for using forged documents to access other people's financial accounts. It wasn't comprehensive financial reform, but it was meaningful protection for vulnerable individuals who might otherwise be victimized by sophisticated fraud schemes. "And the best part," Savannah added, "is that Adrian's crisis management firm is being investigated by the Justice Department for their role in the disinformation campaign. Turns out that fabricating evidence and coordinating false witness testimony violates several federal laws about obstruction of justice." Eleanor raised her wine glass in a toast to the power of comprehensive truth over sophisticated lies. We drank to that sentiment, but I found myself thinking about the deeper lessons I'd learned during the past year. Adrian's manipulation had succeeded initially because I'd wanted to believe that someone could love me without requiring me to diminish myself to make them comfortable. His fraud network had operated successfully because victims like Mrs. Vasquez had trusted that professional men in expensive suits were trying to help them rather than exploit them. The real victory wasn't just exposing Adrian's crimes or recovering stolen property, it was demonstrating that trust could be rebuilt, that institutions could be reformed, and that people who abused power could be held accountable even when they seemed untouchable. After dinner, I drove to my new apartment in Capitol Hill, a space I'd chosen for its proximity to Grace's advocacy center and its distance from the sterile luxury of my temporary downtown rental. The apartment was smaller than any place I'd lived since graduate school, but it felt like home in a way that the waterfront house never had. I was reviewing foundation business plans when my phone rang with a call from an unexpected source, Judge Morrison, who'd presided over my divorce proceedings. "Miss Tran," he said, "I wanted to reach out personally to express my admiration for how you've handled the aftermath of your divorce case. When I awarded the house to Mr. Royce, I believed I was following the law as written in your prenuptial agreement. Learning that the agreement itself was based on fraudulent representations has been deeply troubling. Thank you, Your Honor. I appreciate that. I also wanted you to know that your case has influenced how I approach similar proceedings. Judge Morrison continued. I now require much more extensive documentation when prenuptial agreements involve significant asset transfers, and I've implemented procedures to identify potential signs of financial abuse or coercion. The conversation reminded me that our investigation had created ripple effects far beyond Adrian's immediate network. Family courts were implementing new protections against financial manipulation. Banking regulators were requiring enhanced verification procedures. Congressional oversight committees were examining how private wealth could be used to corrupt regulatory processes. But perhaps most importantly, women who'd experienced financial abuse were discovering that they weren't alone and that recovery was possible even from the most sophisticated betrayals. Before going to bed, I finally drafted a response to Adrian's letters, not because he deserved forgiveness, but because Grace was right that he deserved acknowledgement that I'd moved beyond what he'd done. Adrian, I wrote, I received your letters requesting forgiveness and expressing regret about your behavior during our marriage and afterward. I want you to understand that forgiveness isn't something I owe you, and regret isn't something that repairs the damage you caused to me and to the dozens of other people you systematically defrauded. What you did wasn't the result of childhood trauma or addiction issues that happened to you. It was the result of choices you made repeatedly over several years to prioritize your own interests over the well-being of people who trusted you. Mrs. Vasquez didn't lose her house because you had personal problems. She lost her house because you decided that stealing from elderly homeowners was an acceptable way to fund your lifestyle. I've moved beyond what you did to me, but not through forgiveness. I've moved beyond it by building something meaningful. From the experience, a foundation that will help other women recover from financial abuse, advocacy work that will protect vulnerable communities from predatory development, and institutional reforms that will make it harder for people like you to exploit trust and manipulate financial systems. You taught me that charming presentation can disguise systematic cruelty, that intimate knowledge can be weaponized, and that people who seem successful and respectable can be fundamentally corrupt. But you also taught me that intelligent response to betrayal can create positive change that extends far beyond personal recovery. I don't forgive you, Adrian, but I do thank you for inadvertently showing me capabilities I didn't know I possessed and motivating me to use those capabilities to protect other people from experiencing what you put me through. I hope you use your time in prison to genuinely understand the impact of your choices rather than simply seeking absolution from the people you harmed. I signed the letter, sealed it in an envelope addressed to Adrian's federal prison, and placed it on my desk next to the architectural plans for converting our former house into the foundation headquarters. The next morning, I would begin the process of transforming Adrian's monument to manipulation into something that would actually help people rebuild their lives after systematic betrayal. The house he'd taken from me had become the foundation for ensuring that other women wouldn't face such betrayals alone or without resources for recovery. It was, I realized, exactly the kind of justice that would have been impossible to imagine during those dark months when I'd thought recovery meant simply getting back what had been stolen from me. Real recovery had meant becoming someone who could ensure that theft and betrayal led to meaningful consequences and systemic change rather than just personal loss and private suffering. Adrian had tried to teach me that trust was weakness and that intelligence was meaningless without ruthless self-interest. Instead, he'd taught me that trust could be rebuilt, that intelligence was most powerful when used to protect others, and that the best revenge was creating a world where people like him couldn't succeed. The house was just a house, but what I'd built from losing it was something far more valuable than real estate. It was proof that betrayal could be transformed into justice, that isolation could become community, and that systematic cruelty could be met with systematic compassion. Standing at my apartment window, looking out at the city where Adrian was now serving his federal sentence while Mrs. Vasquez tended her reclaimed garden and Grace advocated for displaced families and Owen ensured banking compliance and Renata investigated institutional corruption, I understood finally that the woman who'd married Adrian Royce had been destroyed completely. She'd been replaced by someone much more dangerous to people who abused trust and much more valuable to people who needed protection from such abuse. And that, I thought, as I prepared for another day of foundation work, was exactly who I'd always been meant to become. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.